And we're off to start. I want to welcome everybody to our live presentation tonight on supporting students with hearing loss in the classroom. I want to make sure people who don't know CPAC learn a little bit about us tonight. We are the Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center, and we do call ourselves CPAC. We are Connecticut's Parent Training and Information Center under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We're staffed by highly trained parents who are also parents of kids with special needs themselves. And it is our philosophy that parents make the best advocates for their child, given the information that they need to be able to participate effectively in educational decision making. So we're really glad that people are here and able to join us. If there are any people that are joining us that have any personal stories, we ask that you consider this as a public forum, and personal stories might be better addressed in our office. We are free. You can call us and our parent consultants will talk to you about your particular situation. So please don't hesitate. Also recognize that we are not attorneys and nothing we say should be construed as legal advice. That being said, let's welcome Julia tonight to be our presenter. And Julia, if you'd like to introduce yourself and get started, welcome.
Sure. Thank you, Jane. Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Garrick. I'm the Senior Educational Audiologist at the New England Center for Hearing Rehabilitation. We're known as NECHEAR in Hampton, Connecticut, and I'll be talking with you today about supporting students with hearing loss in the classroom. Oh, my slide is not advancing here. Oh, Jane, you're muted.
I see. I said our first technology issue.
Here we go.
Oh, there you go.
All right. So on today's agenda, what we'll be talking about hearing loss and a little bit on auditory processing disorder. I'm so sorry. It's supposed to be advancing. Let me see. It seems that there's a lag here. There we go. We'll be touching upon hearing devices and current technology, the impact of hearing loss on access in the classroom. We're going to talk about classroom acoustic factors, accommodations and supports that are available to students, and then considerations for educational planning and assessments. Very importantly, team collaboration, and then I'll share some resources that are for families, providers, and educators. Just an important note I want to discuss before proceeding. This presentation does focus primarily on students who use listening and spoken language as their primary mode of communication and who are enrolled in mainstream education. It is recommended that students who are deaf or hard of hearing who use American Sign Language as their primary mode of communication have access to an ASL interpreter in their educational environments, as well as other accommodations that are appropriate for the student's individualized communication needs. These might include captioning, visual supports, and other accommodations that are included in this presentation that we'll touch upon. So just a basic review of hearing loss types and degrees. So there's 3 types of hearing loss. You can have sensory neural, which involves the cochlea or the hearing organ, and possibly the auditory nerve or the neural component. Conductive, which involves the middle ear space. Conductive hearing loss can be due to middle ear fluid, ear infections. There could be something with the bones in the middle ear space, but it's just this space that's impacted with conductive hearing loss. And then there's mixed, where you can have a combination of the two. Hearing loss can also be stable, meaning it stays the same for the entirety of someone's life. Hearing loss can be fluctuating. It can increase and decrease over time, or hearing loss may be progressive, where there's more hearing loss occurring over time. And this can often be due to a genetic cause or something related in that matter for progressive hearing loss. So there are different degrees of hearing loss. The graph on the left is an audiogram. It's graphical representation of hearing. From left to right, we have low pitched or low frequency to high pitch or high frequency. And from top to bottom, we have soft sounds down to the loudest sounds that we hear. And over here, it's color coded the various degrees of hearing loss. So when someone has an audiogram, you kind of quantify their hearing using these means. This yellow shaded area is famously known as the speech banana. It contains the specific frequency energies for the different sounds of speech. So for example, if someone has a high frequency, moderate hearing loss, they will have more difficulty accessing and hearing the F sound, S, TH, those high frequency sounds. So I just wanted to include a note about auditory processing disorder because a lot of the accommodations and supports I'm going to talk about tonight will also benefit and apply to a student who has auditory processing, even if they have normal peripheral hearing. So according to Fosnight et al. From a 2021 article, APD is a disorder that is marked by a deficit in the way the brain receives, differentiates, analyzes, and interprets auditory information. And the indicators or signs for APD can heavily resemble a student with hearing loss. So having difficulty hearing in the presence of background noise, hearing over a distance or a soft speaker, or hearing a signal accurately when there's a competing signal. So a lot of times these students may be referred for a hearing test and it may show normal hearing, but that's not the whole picture for these students. So different types of hearing devices. There are acoustic hearing devices, which are, when you think of a traditional on the ear or behind the ear hearing aid, that's an acoustic device. There are bone hearing devices, which can be bone anchored or bone conduction. That is a device that goes behind the ear and it transmits sound via vibrations through the temporal bone directly to the cochlea. So this is a device that could be used for a student who has conductive hearing loss and we need to bypass whatever's going on in the middle ear space. And it can also be used for students who have what's called single-sided deafness, where a hearing aid or other device won't give them access on the side with the hearing loss. So the bone anchored hearing aid will bring the sound over to the opposite ear. And then there's neural hearing devices, which are cochlear implants. So there's an implant that is inside of the cochlea, and there's an external part that's worn on the head that it resembles a hearing aid in the sense it goes behind the ear. And there's a magnet and a cochlear implant processor will convert an acoustic signal into a digital signal, which is then turned into an electrical signal that the brain can interpret. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through these slides in depth, but I just wanted to provide the examples of the images so you can see them. So these are the examples of, traditional hearing aids. These are bone anchored bone conduction devices. Some of them are adhered using a sticker. There's a soft band, which is a headband that's particularly coupled to the device. And then there's also a surgical bone anchored hearing aid, which can sometimes be confused with a cochlear implant. They are different. And then this is an example. This boy right here is wearing a cochlear implant. That's a sound processor. And this is an image of what the implant with the electrode array in the cochlea would look like on the inside. So to touch upon some updates in technology, hearing aids and devices do much more than just processing and transmitting sound now. You can even control these devices through smartphone apps, which has been pretty game-changing for parents and caregivers for, especially young children when you're trying out different programs. They even have the Find My Hearing Aid features, which has been, I know, beneficial for many of the families who I work with. You can direct stream. So, a high school student can listen to their music directly to their hearing aids. There's remote microphone options, which is basically an FM system for home use and social use. And even the remote microphone technology has come a long way with adapting to different listening situations and environments that a student might find themselves in.
So that would work in the classroom in a regular FM unit?
It could be used. So some of them are purposefully designed without education in mind. So some of them, like there's no quick mute function. That's really important in a classroom. But some of them are designed for at-home use, quote unquote, but they might be really appropriate for like a high school age student, say, more so than one of the traditional FMs that a younger student might wear. So it depends on the student really, and it depends on the classroom. So this is just a comment that we hear sometimes. So, the student has access through their hearing technology. They can hear normally now, right? Well, the short answer is no. Hearing aids and devices, the goal is to make sounds audible to a student. It doesn't change their hearing level or reverse hearing. And even with their devices and with optimal access, students are still at risk for misperceptions in their educational environments. The other thing to keep in mind is that hearing loss is very individualized. So the audiogram is not the whole picture for a student. Two students could have very similar hearing profiles and need completely different supports in the classroom. So this is just a quick example. These two students, so student 1 has bilateral cochlear implants, and student 2 has a hearing aid and wears a BAHA, or a bone anchored hearing aid, on their other ear. And as you can see, in these different listening conditions, they perform very differently. So we say, there's no blanket recommendation for all students with hearing loss. Every student is different in terms of what they need to succeed in the classroom.
That's a really huge message, I think, because oftentimes people say, well, I've already worked with a student and this worked for them, but that is really not necessarily a basis for the other student.
Exactly. And these next two slides are going to tell us why. There are so many important factors that go into determining, what is the student's current communication skills, what's their familiarity and comfort level with their own hearing loss, managing their devices, and what's their listening age versus chronological age. There's a lot of factors that give us the full hearing profile picture in terms of what does the student need in the classroom to succeed. So we want to know, is the hearing loss congenital, meaning were they born with it? Is the hearing loss changing over time? Do we need to be aware of that and look for potential behavior changes or any concerns? Or was the hearing loss acquired, meaning they were born without hearing loss and then acquired hearing loss later on in life. There's also the possibility that a student has had hearing loss late identified, meaning they had hearing loss for a number of years, but it was later identified, and that's when they started wearing hearing devices and addressing it in that manner. What also is very important to consider is relevant medical history and genetics. Are there co-occurring things? Maybe the student has a vision loss. Maybe there's physical or oral motor things going on. All of this is part of the bigger picture in ensuring that the student has everything they need to have access in the classroom. Some other critical factors include what language is spoken consistently in the home, in addition to what language modality the family has chosen. And every student in the state of Connecticut, whether they have an IEP or a 504 plan, is required to have a language and communication plan. And the language and communication plan, or the LCP, basically lists out, what is the student entitled to, including the availability of a deaf or hard of hearing adult role model, and peers, and a peer group of their communication mode or language. Yes, and that is a great way when you're having meetings with the school team to talk about, introducing how do we appropriately provide the student access in terms of their language. So the schools are required through the IDEA law to provide free and appropriate public education. In order for a student with hearing loss to access their curriculum, it needs to be in the language that they know. And then another critical factor is results of functional testing. So we want to know, we have the audiogram, but what does that mean? And for the classroom, what does that mean for social experiences? So we want to know, what do they hear in background noise? What's their speech perception in different simulated listening environments? And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
So Julia, my quick question on that is, are you usually as an audiologist part of making that language and communication plan? Who would be the team that has the expertise to put that together?
Yes, so I definitely recommend, and we'll talk about this a little more too with team collaboration, that a professional with expertise in working with students with hearing loss be involved in all the team decisions for these students, which include the language and communication plan. It's really the first thing that's supposed to be discussed during the PPT or the 504 meeting, because it determines all the other things that will fall into place for the student to have access. And it's not designed, it's not supposed to be one person who does their homework and fills it out. It's really supposed to be a team decision. And it takes, less than 10 minutes really to go through it line by line with everyone, including the family present, to put that together.
Thanks.
So Of course. So how does hearing loss impact a student's access in the classroom? Hearing loss can cause difficulty with the use and understanding of grammar. It can cause difficulty with learning new vocabulary. Students students with hearing loss need 3 times the amount of exposure to learn new words and concepts. And, some of the accommodations I'm going to talk about are there to help prevent the student from mishearing something and learning it that way. So a good example, other than the little comic we have here, is I work, with a student who she learned a song. This was in kindergarten, and she went home that day and sung the song to her mother. And she said, honey, that doesn't make sense. And she became very frustrated, very defensive. And she said, well, that's what the teacher said, that's what it has to be. And it took a week of unlearning that to then realize, oh, there was a communication breakdown. How do we handle this? So our goal is to prevent those communication breakdowns from happening. So this graphic really tells us everything points to access. A student with hearing loss may not hear something or mishear something. There may be background noise. All of this active listening can lead to auditory fatigue. There may be other things happening at the same time, such as developmental delays or processing concerns. All of these things together can cause the impedance of language development, comprehension, speech production, and that may cause difficulties with academic achievement and social interaction. So classroom considerations, there's a lot of words on this page. Overall, there's a lot to consider, but each student will vary in how each factor affects their success in the classroom. It's important to keep all of these in mind. Oops, that's one too far. It's important to keep all of these in mind, especially because as a student grows older, each year they'll have a different, team of teachers, different classroom, and all of these factors will change with that. So first we'll touch upon classroom acoustic factors, which include distance, reverberation, and background noise. So with distance, this is just a graphic to show, the farther away a student is from the talker, the softer the speech signal is going to be by the time it reaches them. And as the distance increases, that also increases as well. We say every child has a listening bubble, and for children with hearing loss, that bubble is much smaller, often 3 to 6 feet at the maximum. Students with hearing loss are working hard to hear all day. They're not necessarily passively hearing and have that passive access to incidental language the way their peers with normal hearing do. We now know that approximately 80% of new words are learned by overhearing, which again, a student with hearing loss, their bubble for that is going to be much smaller. So this is a good graphic from Success for Kids with Hearing Loss, which is a resource I'll share later, that as an example, for a student with hearing loss without her hearing aids on, you'd have to be very close to her for her to have access. With hearing aids on, you can be slightly farther away, but again, once you're more than about 6 feet, the hearing aids are not, and cochlear implants in general, hearing devices are not optimized for that kind of listening. And this is one of the reasons why we have all of these recommended accommodations for listening in the classroom, because oftentimes there's distance, whether it's between the teacher and the student or between another student or peer. And then there's all the other factors that we're going to talk about too, like reverberation. So reverberation is, or RT is reverberation time. That's the length of time required for a sound to decay 60 dB from its initial level. So essentially how long it takes for an echo to die down is the way we say it. Of course, different rooms have different acoustical requirements depending on the building materials, the materials inside of the room, the surface area, all of that. Open plan classrooms are particularly challenging listening environments because there's a big expansive space. There's oftentimes more reverberation and more noise. How do we reduce reverberation? We can do this by 2 ways. We can reduce the room volume and we can increase sound absorption. And it's not as simple as adding a carpet in, but doing things like that is immensely helpful. So carpeted areas, chairs on covers on the bottoms of chairs and tables, adding soft materials to the room like artwork and curtains, all of that will help with the sound absorption and decreasing reverberation in the classroom.
It's got to make PE though and the cafeteria really challenging spaces.
Definitely. And we'll touch upon that too. So reverberation, what it does essentially is it degrades and distorts the signal. So there is sound bouncing around the room. That's what's happening, and it makes it that much harder to hear and understand what's going on in the classroom. So some potential sources of reverberation in this room, we're looking at it, pretty open concept, a lot of hard surfaces. There are cement walls, there's an uncovered window, there's hard bookshelves, there's a play area where there's no carpeting, and then the whole room does have hard tile flooring. So there are a lot of opportunities in this particular classroom for reverberation to occur, which again will reduce the clarity of the speech signal for whoever's talking, whether it's the student or the teacher. So next acoustic factor we'll talk about is background noise. This is a nice visual from successforkidswithhearingloss.com where +20 represents +20 dB SNR, or signal to noise ratio, meaning the teacher's voice is 20 dB louder than the background noise. And -5 means the teacher's voice is slightly softer than the background noise. So up here at this first sentence, I see some beautiful flowers. We can read it relatively well. It's clear, there's contrast. When we get down to the bottom, it's almost impossible to read that sentence. And that's what it's like listening in an environment with a low signal to noise ratio. It's difficult to pick out what is the actual signal of interest with all the competing noise. So some challenging situations where there might be excessive amounts of background noise can include the cafeteria, the gymnasium for physical education, assemblies, music and band rooms. And other sources of noise that can occur in just the regular education classroom include, HVAC systems, heaters, fans blowing. Hallway noise is a big culprit. And I know right now a lot of educators are being asked to not close their doors due to COVID. So there's a lot of factors to consider. There's some noise sources that we can't necessarily control for, including HVAC systems, but there's other ones that we can control for, including student generated noise, the noise of the chairs, electronics and fans, things like that. So background noise essentially creates, it's like the cocktail party effect. If you're in a loud place, you're going to raise your voice. So students are talking more loudly in order to be heard, and it's creating this cycle of increasing background noise, which, is going to directly impact the student's ability to perceive speech, to, continue paying attention, concentrate on tasks, and behave appropriately and have social conversations. Students with hearing loss are already utilizing more cognitive resources and putting forth more effort to hear, even when there is no background noise present. So when it is, it's particularly exhausting for a student. In 2004, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, or ASHA's working group on classroom acoustics, came out and publicly stated that they support the ANSI standard, or the American National Standards Institute recommendation for classrooms to be a certain level when they're unoccupied. So 35 dBA, it's a relatively soft level, but if you have a fan blowing due to COVID, if you have, something charging and it's buzzing, all of those things contribute to that noise. And that the signal to noise ratio should be at least 15 or +15 dB at the child's ears. And then that unoccupied classroom reverberation not surpass 0.6 seconds. So that echo should die down within 0.6 seconds. Research actually indicates that only 10 to 30% of classrooms meet these standards. It is voluntary, but a lot of school districts have made the initiative to make classrooms more acoustically friendly. It benefits all students, not just students with hearing loss. And an important thing to remember is that, school planners and architects are people who also have to be informed about this, because they're thinking about, how can we make this building economical, how make it make sense, the safety concerns. Acoustics tend to fall back sometimes. And we see that a lot with open floor plan classrooms. So this is an example of the effects of noise on speech perception. Again, every student with hearing loss is different and their needs will be individualized, but this is just an example to show. So this student in the red with normal hearing was able to achieve 90% of the words correct when listening in a +6 dB SNR, meaning the teacher's voice was a little louder than the background noise. There's another student with hearing loss at that same level achieved 30% correct of the words. That student was able to achieve 90% correct, but not until there was a significantly higher signal to noise ratio. And there are ways to improve the signal to noise ratio in a classroom, and we're going to cover those soon. This is just another example of the effects of noise and reverberation on listening. So we have a student with, these are average scores, so students with normal hearing versus students with hearing loss. And as you can see, as the signal to noise ratio goes down, so listening in quiet versus listening in noise, the scores go down. And as we go across with longer reverberation times, the scores go down as well. And between the normal hearing and the hearing loss scores, there is a big difference for all of the conditions. So when we talk about today's classroom, there are a lot of things to consider. It's not just lecture. Lecture is definitely a part of it, but we have to take into consideration all of the different instructional styles that are being employed today. There's a lot of peer listening as well. There's cooperative learning where the teacher is facilitating discussion between the peers, and students have to listen where there's multiple groups of students talking in a room, partner work, all of those things. And then of course, most classrooms today incorporate media and technology somehow into the classroom. And we have to take into consideration the listening with hearing devices to recorded content is very different than listening with to a live person speaking. There's a degraded quality to some level of the signal, and that poses challenges on accessing instructional material. So I want to talk a little bit about auditory fatigue, because all of these things we are discussing can lead to auditory fatigue. Like I said before, students with hearing loss are employing more cognitive resources. They are working hard to listen all day long, even if they're mostly in a quiet environment. They are not passively listening like their peers with normal hearing are. Some signs of auditory fatigue can include inattentiveness, or the student may be easily distracted. Their head may be down on the desk, or they might be looking away from you. If they're a very young child and they're frustrated, they might just take their devices off or request a listening break. And students may just report generally feeling more tired, than their peers do. It's important to remember again that every student is different, and some students may experience this more or less than others. So some considerations to keep in mind right now with the pandemic still going on, we do have communication barriers in place. So face masks and face coverings, they degrade the speech signal, the acoustics of your voice, and they reduce access to lip reading and visual cues. Distancing from peers, again, the farther away a student is from the talker of interest, the more difficult it's going to be for them to hear them. And then listening again to recorded media versus live talking. With remote learning, there may or may not be visual cues provided depending on the setup. The quality of the signal is a huge part of it. If someone's cutting in and out while a student is presenting something, it's going to be very difficult to access what's going on. And then there's a whole host of things we can talk about with captioning and finding, good quality, good timing captioning. So some accommodations and supports for improving access we are going to talk about. I just wanted to mention a few common misconceptions that we hear sometimes. So someone might say, what other students say doesn't matter as much as what the teacher says, which again, we know students are learning through incidental learning, and it's very important for them to be, developing friendships and being able to hear what their peers are saying, mainly because the peers are contributing a lot more now than they used to be in class discussions and in group work. They follow along with my directions, so they must understand what I'm saying, or they get good grades, so they must be fine. The thing is, there's no way to know if a student is missing something. And we can't expect a student to know 100% of the time if they're missing something, because if you think about it, you're not going to know if you're missing something or mishearing it, if you're missing it or mishearing it. And, if the child is young enough, they might not have the language skills or communication skills to articulate that, that what they heard doesn't make sense. It's not a real word. It doesn't follow along with what was happening. Students with hearing loss can develop many coping strategies where they might look around the room to see what their peers are doing, and then they know what to do based on that. Or they might hear, one part of what you said and take that and assume the rest. So it's difficult to know, just because they're doing well doesn't mean they're not missing things, and doesn't mean they're, not working 3 times as hard as their peer next to them to hear what's going on. So these are some possible accommodations. There's equipment management, noise reduction strategies using an FM system, media and technology accommodations, strategic seating, captioning, there's listening and language facilitation, preview, review, and note-taking. A few other ones are, repeating and rephrasing as needed. The student might benefit from visual supports, whether that's pictures, written words, providing an outline, writing down new vocabulary words on the board. Some students may need additional time for processing information. And there's also the emergency alerting protocol. So this is another requirement of the language and communication plan. It was added in 2019, I believe. And this protocol basically lists, it lists out the plan for if there were ever an emergency, how do we ensure that this student heard what's going on, knows what to do, feels safe, and to make sure they know what to do. So sometimes the emergency alerting protocol can include the student having a go bag. So they may have like a little bag with a whiteboard and a marker and their batteries for their devices. So, in the event if there's an emergency and there's a lockdown and their batteries die, we don't want them to have to go without access. So they have that available. Other ones might include pictures to be put on the desk so the student knows, oh, it's a fire drill, oh, it's a lockdown, especially if the adults in the room or anyone can't talk or has to whisper. Visual supports can be very helpful with that. And then another accommodation is opportunities for peer interaction. So like Jane said earlier, hearing in the cafeteria can sometimes be very challenging for students. And I work with a number of students who engage in what's called lunch bunch. So they're provided an opportunity to have lunch with their peers in a quieter environment so that they can access what's going on and they're not being overstimulated. And then also exposure to peers who use the same communication mode. This is another part of the language and communication plan. So when we talk about equipment management, there's multiple parts to this, and part of it is educating the team and having this continuous collaboration. So we always recommend that students with hearing loss, that their educational team receive an in-service at the beginning of the year or anytime there's some staff changes. And this talks about the students' hearing history, their language skills, their particular strengths, areas of improvement. And then we usually demo the equipment so that whoever is assisting them or being the point of contact knows what to do if something is wrong. We provide basic troubleshooting guides and resources that talk about the parts and pieces of the equipment. And then we continue this support through regular consultations. So this might look like a monthly observation of the classroom or a monthly team meeting, or a teacher of the deaf or hard of hearing may meet with a student every other week to work on goals, but also collaborate with the team and do observations of the rooms. Listening checks are a very important part of managing students' equipment, especially when they are very young and are not able to articulate yet if something is wrong. Extra batteries, of course, having supplies available is very important in the event a battery does die or something happens. And then probably the most important thing is knowing who to contact. It's really important that the student's educational team have a consistent person who they can contact for troubleshooting support. If there's any concerns for access, that they can contact someone and have that consistent communication.
Julia, did you mention a certain time frame that's a good time frame to, like, maybe not regulation, but a recommendation on how frequently these consultations take place?
Yeah, definitely. We usually try to do in-services before the first day of school. We know that the teachers, time is very limited in those 2-3 days before school starts with professional development. But, the earlier you reach out to the team, the higher likelihood there is of us being able to get that meeting in. Sometimes if the teachers are already determined for the following year, we even do the meeting in June at the end of the previous school year. But sometimes it's nice to do it closer to the start of the school year because that information is fresh on the teacher's mind, and they can think about, setting up their classroom in the best way possible for the student. And then anytime there's a change, so let's say it's a high school student and they have a whole different set of teachers come January, I would definitely recommend that, another in-service be provided. And it's important for every age and every grade level because there are different challenges for every age and every grade level. A kindergartner is not going to necessarily know yet how to change their battery, how to troubleshoot. A high schooler might do that, but it might also be really important for a high school teacher to know, you can't call this student out in front of their peers. There's a certain way to handle the FM and all of that. So it's definitely important for every age and every skill level. So some strategies for reducing noise in the classroom. We talked about this a little bit earlier, including acoustic silencers. So you can see in the photo here, there's tennis balls on the bottoms of the chairs. I've been in classrooms where this isn't feasible simply because someone has a latex allergy. So there's other bottoms that can be put on the chairs. Addition of soft surfaces, keeping the classroom doors and windows closed, which, as we know, with COVID, that may or may not be permitted. And then again, depending on the room, more or less may need to be done in order to make it as acoustically friendly as possible. So another accommodation is an FM or DM system. So I use those terms kind of interchangeably here. FM is frequency modulation, and DM is digital modulation. It's essentially the newer version of FM. And we typically say FM system because that is what everyone is kind of familiar with and has on their radar. There's two types of FM systems. There's a sound field, meaning the teacher has a microphone and their voice goes to a speaker system. It might be in the walls, it might be a tower, but it's not going to any student individually in particular. And then there's a personal FM system where the teacher has a microphone and the student may have boots or receivers that attach to their hearing devices, or depending on the device, it may go directly to the devices and they don't need boots. There may also be a pass around or a peer microphone. So if the student has a one-on-one paraprofessional support, that might be a great microphone for that individual to wear. How it works is that the microphone or transmitter picks up the talker's voice and it's brought directly to the student's device, making it ear level. This directly improves the signal to noise ratio. So instead of that student having to work 5 times as hard to hear over the noise, they have to work a little less hard. They can focus more on the content of what you're saying and learning versus focusing on hearing you correctly. So this is an example, a visual example of what I just said. So this is that distance causing the signal to noise ratio, the level of the volume level of the speaker's voice decreasing over distance, but with an FM system, it's staying at relatively the same level the entire time because it's ear level for the student. So what's really important with FM systems is proper and appropriate use. So the FM microphone, I usually say, it's wrong. It's worse to use an FM system wrong than it is to not use it. The microphone should be muted anytime the signal is not directed at the student. So if the teacher is answering the phone, talking to another student, leaving the room, talking about a secret field trip, we hear all sorts of things from our older students.
Going to the bathroom.
Yes, going to the bathroom. And we don't want that happening. One, because if a student is constantly hearing irrelevant speech, they're going to learn to tune out what they're hearing. And the second reason is because it's going to be very distracting. If they're trying to have a conversation with their peer during snack time and they're hearing you, talking privately to another student in their ear, they're going to have less awareness of what's going on around them and have a harder time developing those conversational skills. Another important thing when using an FM microphone is keeping it nice and quiet. So this is all information that we talk about during the in-services and the FM trainings with the school team, how to wear the microphone, how to use it appropriately, all of that. This is an example on the right side here of the Phonak Roger touchscreen. It's a personal DM microphone that's currently available. And then for FM use, for successful continued FM use, we want to be able to identify issues as they arise. And we can do this by doing listening checks every day. The team can refer to the resources and guides that have been provided by the audiologist. And again, knowing who to contact if and when an issue does arise, because something, always comes up.
Are you going to talk about the use of the pass around microphone for students? Because I've trained a room of adults with an adult needing the pass around microphone, and the adults were not really patient, and they wouldn't really wait till they had the microphone fully in front of them to speak. They were anxious to talk, and the microphone didn't reach them, but they were already talking. I wonder if students do the same thing.
Yes. So it depends on the classroom setup, on the structure of the room, the age of the students. For younger kids, it's a really great way to actually help keep the noise low and establish that rule of, it's your turn to talk when you have the microphone or when you have the cup. Sometimes, especially now with sanitary reasons and not touching things, multiple kids touching things, they might have the microphone placed in like a little cup, and the cup gets passed, and you don't talk until you have the cup and it's your turn. As students get older, it's more on the student to facilitate the optimal conversational situation, and to advocate for their needs, like if they're doing partner work and the other student needs to use the microphone. I honestly haven't heard that issue happening too often with like middle school, high school age students. It's typical for students as they get older to develop a social awareness of their hearing loss, and some students feel like they don't want to look or appear different than their other peers, and use of that pass around microphone may drop off as they get older. And we really rely on those environmental modifications and other supports in place to ensure they have access for peer listening. A big part of accessing what peers say right now with COVID, because students are wearing face masks, is the teacher facilitating that access by using the FM system. So, let's say the student is seated on the towards the front right side of the classroom, and Joey is seated in the far left back corner of the room, and he says 18, and you say that's right, and you move on. The student with a hearing loss might not have caught who was talking, and they might not have heard what he said. So if you can say, Joey said 18, that's right, and then you move on, you're giving the student time to find who is talking, and you're ensuring that they're hearing what they said, because you're repeating it into the microphone. That right now with the pandemic and everything that's going on, that is the best way to provide access to peers during whole group instruction. There are other things to try for small group, which include, using a pass around microphone. Some microphones like this one here on the slide can actually be used in group mode. It can be laid down flat on the table and pick up about 6 feet of people's voices and noises. And the other parts are environmental modifications. So the students group shouldn't be sitting in the middle of the room, where there's 5 other groups working. They should be in the quietest corner of the room. Or if they're allowed to, they could even work in the hallway if it's quieter out there. We want as little noise coming from behind them as possible, and their peers in front of them, so that they can access them both visually and auditorily the best that they can.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. So this is just a little example of what can happen with misuse of the FM. So again, the microphone should be muted anytime the signal is not directed at the student. Everything looks great here. She has great microphone placement. The teacher is keeping the book she's holding away from the microphone so that those pages rustling aren't being heard by the student. However, she's only working with a portion of the students. There's other students in the room doing another activity. So this is the student with hearing loss, and the microphone was left unmuted. So he is still hearing what the teacher is reading to the other students. And these students are giggling because he's saying, did you say peanut butter? All I hear is something about an alligator. And it's kind of a funny slide and making light of it, but it's, muting is one of the most important things with FM use, and we really stress it. It's also the most difficult thing, because teachers, especially of younger grades, those classrooms are so dynamic, and there are so many things happening at once. And Jane, this goes back to what you asked earlier with, can any microphone, remote microphone or FM be used in the classroom? Teachers need to have access to a quick mute where they can mute and unmute as, they're going over to this student who just knocked over a pile of books and they're going, going throughout their day with multiple students. So some media and technology accommodations, the FM system can usually be plugged right directly into a computer for direct streaming to a student's hearing aids or hearing devices. This is another area where one blanket recommendation, it's not one size fits all for students. There's a variety of different ways to access their electronic, media-based instruction. So strategic seating, we want to think strategically. So front and center is not always better. We don't want to make any assumptions. So, do they have a unilateral hearing loss? Should the student be seated on one side of the room versus another? What seating arrangement is going to provide them the best auditory and visual access to the teacher and peers? And we also want to avoid sources of noise. So we don't want the student seated right next to the heater that's blowing or the door that has to stay open and there's, or a sink or a pencil sharpener. Those are the kinds of things we want, we talk about during the in-service. In a classroom where it might be an older students where there's a lot of whole group instruction, a U shape is actually really fantastic for students with hearing loss because it provides great visual access and they can have, no noise coming from one side and be focused on what's happening in front of them. And then again, for group work, preferred seating might be in a quiet corner of the room, or it might be out of the classroom if the noise level is really that loud. So captioning, when to introduce captioning is, again, very individualized. It depends on the student's reading level. It depends on, I have students who they are more distracted by the captioning than without it because of their, because of their visual components. They have other things going on. I have a student with cortical vision impairment, and it's again, not a blanket recommendation, not one size fits all. So the different types of captioning, there's closed captioning, auto captioning, and CART. And CART is communication access in real time. And the captions can be displayed in real time along with the speech signal, and they can be displayed on a laptop, a large screen, or a phone. And CART providers can be in person or can provide CART services remotely. So some supports for auditory fatigue. We, of course, want to monitor fatigue. I can't think of the name of it. The lab at Vanderbilt is actually currently working on a questionnaire with scales to monitor auditory fatigue. How do we quantify this? How do we know when we need to do something for this student? And they will be publishing those soon, hopefully. Providing auditory breaks. Ideally, we want a student to be able to keep their devices on. So an auditory break might look like them stepping out of the room for a few minutes, not more than 3 minutes, just enough time to take a break from being overstimulated or being tired and being in a quiet environment. Pre-teaching vocabulary, so giving students exposure again to new concepts before they have to hear it for the first time in the classroom. Having a quiet workspace, using visual supports, and planning workload and timetables so that for example, their English and history, where they may require a lot of listening to new vocabulary, multisyllabic words. There might be a lot of videos played. If it's possible, maybe not having those classes back to back or having those classes in the same semester. So again, back to COVID, just some in-person learning accommodations to think about. What we learned over this past year with face masks is that clear is not always better. A lot of clear masks, unfortunately, fog. And they are so thick that they distort the acoustics of speech more than surgical masks do. And every student is different. We have students with mild hearing loss who want a clear mask, and we have students who have cochlear implants and they prefer a surgical mask. It's really different for every student. We actually collaborated with other educational audiologists throughout the state of Connecticut to create a questionnaire that can be used to help educators determine which face mask does the student hear the best with, which one do they prefer, to help determine if their educators should be asked to wear one mask over another.
Do you think that's something you could share with us in case a family is interested in accessing it for their teacher? Definitely. Yeah, it's called the BISCU, is the Barrier Impact Screening Questionnaire. Great, thanks.
And then just some strategies for improving access during COVID, like we said before, repeating peers' questions and their answers and comments, using an FM, using a clear animated voice, and again, considering seating, which recommendations might be different than usual if the windows and doors have to be open. So another accommodation is called a listening and language facilitator, or an LF. So the LF basically documents language that's used to give directions in the classroom. They pull out exact examples from class, language from other students, such as sarcasm and things that are casually brought into discussion. And all of this supports equal access in the classroom and language and vocabulary needed for participation. So not every student may need an LF. Particularly, it's important for students who are still presenting with significant difficulties accessing their classroom language, even with their, appropriate accommodations in place. This might be a student who was late identified and new to using their devices, or it might just be a student who has, a communicatively significant hearing loss and has difficulty accessing sound in their environment and processing sound. It can be a support for students of all ages. And the person who can be the LF can include someone who's already involved in the educational team, and they would be trained, by an audiologist or an oral habilitation therapist on how to best facilitate language learning in the classroom. So these are some examples of strategies that an LF would employ to improve a student's access. So chunking of instructions, increasing exposure to new vocab, and repeating and rephrasing. Another thing that they may help with is facilitating peer interactions. So if in particular a younger student is having difficulty hearing what their peers are saying during group work, the LF can facilitate, especially like what you mentioned earlier, Jane, if students are not taking turns, the LF can help them learn how to do that. Oh, I have the pass around now. It's my turn to talk, and facilitate that. And then preview and review, which is basically providing the student an opportunity to learn to hear, see, speak, and learn vocabulary before it's introduced in the classroom. And we do that by providing it in a quiet environment. The student should hear the word, be able to hear themselves saying it, see it written down, and that helps prevent misperceptions from happening in the classroom, so they're not hearing it for the first time there. And note-taking can look different depending on what the student needs. Again, not every student will need this accommodation, but a student may need like a paraprofessional or an IA, or another adult taking notes during the lesson, or there might be a notebook or a binder with resources of the teacher's outlines and PowerPoints, and middle or high school age students may use their cell phone or another device to record lectures with a teacher's permission. So I work with a student who does this. She's a freshman in high school now, and she's already asked all of her teachers for their permission, and they gave her the go ahead. And this is the way she's most comfortable with getting her notes, because then she can go home and listen to what the teacher said, so that she can just focus on what's going on in class versus catching every word during class. So with all of this in mind, again, it's so important to remember that every student with hearing loss is different. So we need to collect individualized information, and that can be done through evaluations, observations, and facilitated peer interactions. We want to set high expectations for these students because they are expected to succeed with appropriate individualized supports being employed in the classroom. So some critical considerations for educational planning includes information from the student's audiologist. So we want to have an updated hearing test. It's important to know what their current hearing is. And then the functional listening or auditory perceptual evaluation, which might be done by the educational audiologist, can include those simulated listening environments and how that student does, listening in noise, listening without versus with the FM system, listening to a video with and without captions. We can even look at auditory processing abilities and access to media. And then of course, updates from the educational audiologist, which might be from observations, questionnaires, FM trial periods, all of that. Some considerations for speech and language or communication testing. So if a speech language pathologist is going to do an evaluation with a student with hearing loss, we want to first make sure the very first thing is to do an equipment check, because if that student's ear molds are plugged with wax, or if a hearing aid battery is dead and it's a student who is not independently alerting adults to that yet, that's going to significantly impact their ability to do the evaluation with you. So we want to make sure, are they hearing optimally before we proceed? Testing should be done in a quiet environment. Visual supports should be provided as appropriate. And then we want to make sure, is the test a fair depiction? This is not a hearing test. This is a test of their speech and language. We need to make sure they're not mishearing the directions. They're not unfamiliar with the vocabulary and the language of the directions, to ensure we're actually looking at the targeted skill, not did they hear you correctly? And then, of course, self-advocacy goals. It is very important to develop independence and confidence for students with hearing loss. That includes awareness of their device functioning, alerting an adult to something not sounding right, knowing who to ask for help during class. That also includes managing their equipment. So once students are in middle school and high school, they become responsible for bringing their FM microphone from class to class. It's not the teacher doing it anymore. And then knowledge of their unique hearing loss and what works for them. So talking with their peers, saying, I can hear you better on my right side. Can you sit on this side? And learning how to be comfortable doing that. And then they, learn that in the school years and can do that going forward in the workplace and at home and with their partners. And then, of course, educating their teachers. So I have some students, they're seniors in high school and they like to do their in-service. They know what works for them, and that's fantastic. Use of compensatory strategies and, preventing communication breakdowns and knowing what to do when a communication breakdown happens. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is team collaboration, which is, in order for a child to succeed in the classroom, we need to have continual collaboration between the family, the audiologist, any private therapists, and the educational team, which might include an occupational therapist, a social worker, guidance counselor, speech language pathologist, whoever it may be, that's a part of that student's team. Everything is related. I think a lot of times hearing loss is looked at as a separate thing. All right, we're going to talk about all this stuff. And then, okay, let's talk about the language and communication plan. But hearing loss impacts everything else that this student does and learns in the classroom. So it's really important that there's communication between the whole team. Some ways we have found to be successful communicating with students' teams is using a Google document. So, the teachers, the parent, and when I say we, I mean the audiologist or oral habilitation therapist at Netgear has access to this Google Doc. So we can put in concerns, they can put in the vocabulary for next week for the therapist to review with that student during their session, and things like that. Other things involve, in-person or virtual meetings, doing observations, and making sure the different team members participate in these. And then what do we share with the team? What's important to include? And the short answer is everything. If the student has had a change in hearing, a change in their speech and language skills, if there's any sort of concern for them accessing the curriculum, if there's a specific success, if something is working really well for them in the classroom, or, they said they're independently correcting the sound S in their words for the first time, and the parent wants to share that with you. All of that is so important to ensuring continued success. So these are some resources that are good for families, teachers, and providers. Success for Kids with Hearing Loss is a fantastic website. They have, again, resources for anyone involved with working with a student with hearing loss or being a parent or caregiver. The Listening Inventory for Education Revised is a questionnaire that's available at Success for Kids. It basically looks at, functionally, how is the student doing? And there's a teacher version and there's also a student version. So whenever there's concerns, that's a good questionnaire to go to, because the student independently reports, how difficult is it for me to hear in this situation versus this situation? And then the teacher can report based on their observations of the student the same thing. Connecticut Hands and Voices is a fantastic organization. Hearing First and AG Bell are two websites for if you're interested in learning more about listening and spoken language resources. And then a lot of hearing device manufacturers actually offer oral habilitation or auditory training resources. So these are the three main cochlear implant companies, and they have some great rehabilitation resources. And then just a few other resources. Of course, I included CPAC, and then PATH. CT or Connecticut is another organization with parent-to-parent networking and support for educational resources. And then Ear Community is actually a group who is focused on microtia and atresia, which is the lack of an ear canal or different like anatomical anomalies of the ear. That's microtia, but they have some great resources, even if that, even if your child doesn't have microtia or atresia, some great resources about supporting you in developing the IEP and 504. And if you come across challenges, how to address those, or if you have questions, they have a really great website for that. I just want to say thank you to my colleagues, Kristen Delay, Emily Patraziba, and Shay Bailey, who contributed to putting together this PowerPoint presentation. So greatly appreciate their support and contribution. And thank you so much for having me. If you have any questions, if you would like any part of this PowerPoint sent to you, if you're more interested in the BISQ questionnaire, please feel free to contact me and I'd be happy to share.
Thank you, Julia. That was great. It was a lot of information in a short period of time, but it was really good. And I think many families will get a lot out of it. I don't know if there's anybody that wants to unmute and ask a question, or if we want to move on, but I think it was really informative to me. And having had that one experience with a deaf participant in my class, it really gives you a sense of how, like, I had to stop people and say, you need to have the microphone. She has a right to access the same information, but it does take some getting familiar with. So it's great information. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.